If Raymond had not stepped in front of my car that night, I would have driven home alone, unlocked my back door, and walked into something I had spent 30 years unknowingly setting in motion. I am Margaret Collins. I am 63 years old, and this is my true story from Memphis, Tennessee. My husband passed 18 months before any of this began. Colon cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by September. Gerald had been a high school football coach for 26 years. He was the kind of man who remembered every player's name, every parent's face, every score from every game he had ever lost. When he died, the house did not just feel empty. It felt like a language I had spent my whole life learning had suddenly been taken from me. And I did not know how to be quiet in my own rooms anymore. We had 2 daughters. The older one lived in Nashville with her husband and their kids. She called every Sunday, faithfully, like a standing appointment. The younger one had moved to Portland 7 years ago and called when the mood struck her, which was not often. Grief, I learned, does not always pull people closer. Sometimes it simply shows you how far apart you already were. I had taught 6th grade English for 31 years. My pension was modest. Gerald's life insurance covered the funeral and the remaining mortgage payments, but it did not cover the rest of living, property taxes, utilities. The slow, grinding cost of being a woman alone in a house built for 2. I was 62 years old and retirement was already behind me, which meant I had no choice but to go back to work. A former colleague told me about an opening at a private medical facility on the eastern edge of Memphis. Not a hospital exactly, more of a specialty clinic that handled post-surgical recovery for patients who could not afford extended hospital stays. They needed someone for the overnight dispensary shift, someone organized, detail-oriented, trusted with medications and paperwork, someone who did not mind the hours. I applied on a Tuesday and started the following Monday. My shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. I logged medications, verified dosages against patient charts, prepared morning rounds for the nurses, and maintained chain of custody records for controlled substances. It was careful, methodical work, and I was good at it. Teaching had trained me to catch small errors before they became large ones. At the dispensary, that skill mattered more than I had expected. That was how I met Raymond. The first time I saw him, he was standing outside the staff entrance at 10 minutes to 10, checking a clipboard in the yellow wash of the security light above the door. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with close cropped gray at his temples, and a stillness about him that reminded me of men who had learned patience the hard way. He nodded as I badged in, said good evening, and went back to his clipboard. I said good evening back. And that was the whole of our first conversation. Raymond worked the same overnight rotation I did. He covered the building from 9 at night until 5 in the morning, walking the halls every 40 minutes, checking the loading dock, the pharmacy corridor, the recovery ward exits. He was thorough without being theatrical about it. He noticed things and said nothing unless the noticing mattered. Within a few weeks, I began leaving a thermos of coffee on the counter near the dispensary window when I knew he would pass on his 9 o'clock round. Nothing elaborate. I brewed it at home before my shift, strong the way I liked it, and I left it with a paper cup and a small note that said, "Help yourself." The first night I did it, he paused, looked at the thermos, then looked toward the dispensary window where I was working. I waved. He poured a cup, nodded once, and kept walking. That became our arrangement without either of us naming it as one. Some nights he stopped and we talked for a few minutes through the window. He told me he had worked security for 20 years, mostly corporate buildings, before taking this job 3 years ago. He liked the quieter pace. He liked that the patients here were recovering, not critical, that the energy of the building was tired rather than desperate. I told him I had been a teacher. He said he could tell. I asked why. He said people who spent their lives watching 30 children at once always had the same quality about them, a kind of peripheral awareness, like they could see the whole room without turning their head. I laughed at that. It was the first time I had laughed at work since starting the job. Over the weeks, I learned that Raymond had a daughter he had not spoken to in 4 years. She lived in Atlanta. He did not offer details, and I did not ask, but occasionally, when the building was very quiet and the night stretched long, he would mention small things. Her birthday falling in March, the way she used to mispronounce the word, particularly when she was small. He always stopped himself quickly after those moments, as if he had said more than he intended and needed to close a door. I understood that feeling exactly. By December, the dispensary work had deepened into something I had not anticipated. My supervisor had asked me to assist with a quarterly audit of controlled substance logs. Routine compliance work, she explained. The state had updated reporting requirements, and the facility needed to ensure its records met the new standard. I began cross-referencing 3 months of dispensary logs against patient files and physician orders. What I found at first seemed minor. A few dosage entries that did not quite match their corresponding physician notes. Not dramatic discrepancies, just small ones. A number written differently in 2 places. A date that did not align. Medications logged as administered that patients had declined. I flagged them for my supervisor, who thanked me and said she would look into it. The next week, 3 of the files I had flagged had been updated. The discrepancies were gone. I did not say anything right away. I told myself I had misremembered. I told myself clerical corrections were normal. But I pulled the paper backups and compared them to the digital records, and the originals no longer matched what I had seen. I was quiet about what I had found, and I kept working. One evening in January, I noticed a car parked near the staff exit when I arrived for my shift. An older white pickup truck with a cracked left taillight, engine running, no one visible inside. I walked past it without slowing. When I mentioned it to Raymond during his first round, he walked to the window and listened carefully. He said he would keep an eye on it. 2 hours later, he told me it was gone. The following Tuesday, I found my locker had been opened. Not forced, opened. The combination lock was intact, but the door was ajar. My spare key fob was missing. I had a spare because I sometimes forgot the first one. The key fob opened the dispensary side door. I reported it to my supervisor and received a replacement the next day. I did not sleep well that week, Raymond noticed. He could read the building and the people in it the same way, he said. I could read a room. One night he asked if everything was all right, and I said yes. And he nodded the way people nod when they have decided not to push but have not stopped paying attention either. In early February, I was cross-referencing a different set of records when I found something that stopped my hands on the keyboard. A patient file I did not recognize, attached to medication logs I had not created. The entries were in my employee ID number, but the timestamps were from nights I had not worked. Someone had used my credentials to log medication transfers. Small amounts, but controlled substances. The kind of thing that, if traced, would point directly to me. I sat very still for a long time. I did not print anything. I did not take any notes at the building. I memorized what I needed, and I closed the file, and I finished my shift without speaking about it to anyone. The next night, I told Raymond. I explained it quietly through the dispensary window, while the recovery ward slept down the hall. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long do you think this has been going on?" "At least 3 months," I told him. "Maybe longer." He nodded slowly. He asked if I had any idea who else had access to my credentials. I told him only supervisory staff and the IT administrator. He asked me the IT administrator's name. I told him. His jaw changed slightly, a small tightening, and I noticed it. "Do you know him?" I asked. Raymond looked at his clipboard. I have driven him somewhere before, he said. He takes evening rides out to the industrial park on Route 78. I offered him a lift once when his car was getting serviced. He called me by my first name like we were already familiar. I had only met him once before. We looked at each other through the window. 3 nights later, Raymond came to the dispensary window at 11 and did not pour his coffee. He stood with his hands at his sides, and his face had a quality I had not seen before, controlled but carrying something heavy. Miss Collins, he said, I need you to listen to me carefully. My stomach dropped. I set down my pen. He told me he had been walking the building earlier that week and had overheard part of a conversation in the IT office. The door was barely open. 2 voices. He recognized the IT administrator, whose name was Dale. The other voice he did not know. Dale said, The audit is getting close. The woman in dispensary is pulling records from the wrong quarter. He paused. Then Dale said, She lives alone, East Side. We know her schedule. The air left the room. Raymond's voice stayed level. I want you to hear me, he said. You are not going home tonight the way you normally go home. I opened my mouth and closed it again. I know this is frightening, he said. I know you are going to want to tell yourself I misheard, but I wrote it down as soon as I left that hallway, and I am telling you exactly what I heard. I believed him. I did not want to, but I believed him completely. We cannot stay here, I said. No, he agreed. We cannot. He walked me out through the loading dock at 5 in the morning, not the staff exit I always used. His car was a dark blue sedan, sensible and quiet. We drove to a diner on Poplar Avenue that opened at 4:30 for truckers and early workers. We sat in a corner booth, and Raymond ordered 2 coffees without asking if I wanted one, and I was grateful for that. Tell me everything you found, he said. All of it. So I did. The audit discrepancies. My credentials being used without my knowledge. The missing key fob. The files that had been altered after I flagged them. As I laid it out, Raymond took a small notebook from his jacket pocket and wrote in a clean, deliberate hand. He had been keeping his own notes, I realized. He showed me. Dates, times, license plates of vehicles he had observed near the staff exit after hours. Twice in 3 weeks. The same white pickup with the cracked tail light. You have been watching this for weeks, I said. He looked at his coffee. After 30 years of walking buildings, you stop seeing things as random, he said. Patterns show themselves if you are patient. There is something else, I told him. I kept my voice even. The quarter I found the falsified entries in. It goes back further than I initially thought. One of the patient files attached to my credentials has a name I recognized. Raymond waited. My husband, I said. Gerald Collins. He was a patient at this facility 6 years ago for post-surgical recovery after knee replacement. His file is in the system because this clinic absorbed records from a facility that closed. Someone accessed his file 3 months after he died and used it to create a false compliance trail. Something about his medication log was altered. The silence between us stretched. Why would someone go back that far? Raymond said quietly. Because whatever they are covering up did not start recently, I said. I think this has been happening for years, and I think my husband's file being in the system was a detail they believed no one would ever check. Because who examines the records of a man who is already dead? Raymond set down his pen. Do you think your husband knew something? He asked. Gerald had been on the board of a community health oversight committee for 4 years before his diagnosis. He had been meticulous about it, the way he was meticulous about everything. He had mentioned once, near the end, that he had passed something along to the state health board. He said it was probably nothing. He said it was just paperwork. He never told me the details because he did not want to worry me. I think he may have filed a complaint years ago, I said, about this same facility, or one connected to it. And I think when I started pulling records, someone recognized my name, or recognized his. Raymond was very still. You were not just a loose end, he said. You were a connection they had already considered. That realization sat between us like a third person at the table. We went to the police that morning. Raymond drove. I brought my notes, the ones I had memorized and reconstructed at home, written on personal paper that never touched the facility. Raymond brought his notebook and his phone, which held photographs he had taken discreetly over the past weeks. Vehicles. Entry times. Dale's car in the lot, at hours he was not scheduled. The detective who took our statement was a woman close to my age, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a manner that was brisk but not unkind. She listened without interrupting, which also reminded me of Raymond. When we finished, she made a phone call and stepped out. She returned with 2 other detectives. They had heard Dale's name before. The facility had been under informal observation for 8 months as part of a broader state investigation into medication diversion schemes at post-surgical care clinics. 3 facilities in the Mid-South region, all connected through the same healthcare management company. Controlled substances being logged as administered to patients, rerouted to black market distributors, covered by falsified records. The estimated value was over $800,000 across the 3 sites. My credentials being used, the detective explained, was not random. It was intentional targeting. My clean record, my temporary status, my lack of institutional relationships at the facility, all of it made me an ideal fall person if the scheme was ever discovered. She paused. Then she said, "Your husband's name appears in a complaint filed with the State Health Board 9 years ago. A complaint about medication irregularities at a clinic that shared ownership with this one. The complaint was investigated and dismissed. The investigator assigned to that case was later found to have accepted payments from the management company. Your husband's name was on a list of people considered potential witnesses." I pressed my hands flat on the table to keep them steady. "Gerald never knew," I said. "He filed that complaint and then he got sick, and he thought it had all come to nothing." "It had not come to nothing," the detective said. "It went underground. And they knew I worked there," I said. "They may have sought it out," she replied carefully. Raymond put his hand on the table near mine, not touching, just present. The same way he had stood outside the dispensary window on quiet nights, close enough to be felt. The warrants moved quickly. By that afternoon, Dale's office had been sealed and his home searched. They found external drives containing patient records from all 3 facilities, communication logs between Dale and 2 supervisors at the management company, and a handwritten list of names. People considered risks. My name was on it, along with a note. Accessed historical files. Check for copies at residence. They had been watching me long enough to know my routines. They had a key to the dispensary side door. They were waiting for a night I stayed late. Raymond had overheard the conversation 4 days before that night would have arrived. The case took 11 months to resolve. State and federal charges, given the scale. I testified at 2 separate proceedings. The first was administrative, before a state health board panel. The second was in federal court, where Dale and 2 senior members of the management company faced charges, including healthcare fraud, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. The third man, the one whose voice Raymond had not recognized, turned out to be a logistics contractor who had coordinated the distribution network. He pleaded guilty before the trial reached him. When Dale was sentenced, he did not look at me in the courtroom. He had the particular quality of a man who had spent years believing he was invisible because no one was paying close enough attention. He was wrong, and the weight of that error showed in every line of his posture. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the same emptiness I had felt after Gerald's funeral, that strange silence that follows something large and irreversible. Justice does not restore what fear takes. It only names the thief. I left the facility shortly after the investigation closed. The clinic itself underwent a complete restructuring under new management. Several supervisors departed. New oversight protocols were implemented and reviewed quarterly. I was told my audit work had been essential to establishing the timeline of fraud. I was thanked in a letter that used very careful language. I went back to work at a smaller medical office on the north side of Memphis. Day shift. Quieter work. Less money, but my hands stopped trembling in the mornings. Raymond retired from overnight security 6 months later. His back had been troubling him for years, and the long night shifts had started to cost him more than they returned. He did not make a ceremony of leaving. He simply stopped showing up for nights and started showing up at the diner on Poplar Avenue on Tuesday mornings, which was when I had a late start. We drank coffee and talked about nothing in particular. About the city, about the weather, about things we had read. He was a man who read widely and quietly, and never mentioned it unless you asked him something that revealed it. One Tuesday in October, his phone rang while we were sitting across from each other. He looked at the screen and something changed in his face. A visible softening that was almost difficult to watch because it revealed how much he usually kept held back. He answered. He said hello in a voice I had not heard him use before. Careful and open at the same time, the voice of a man handling something fragile with both hands. It was his daughter. She had seen a local news segment about the case. She had recognized his name in a brief mention of the security guard, whose observations helped federal investigators establish a timeline. She had been sitting in her apartment in Atlanta, she told him later, watching the screen, and she had not been able to explain why she cried. He stepped outside to finish the call. When he came back in, his eyes were red at the corners, and he sat down and looked at his coffee for a long moment. She wants to talk, he said finally. Really talk. She said she has been thinking about calling for 2 years but did not know how to start. Sometimes it takes something outside us to give us permission to do what we already wanted to do, I said. He nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I have made a lot of mistakes, he said quietly. Most people have, I told him. The ones who know it are the ones who can still do something about it. He looked up at me then, and for the first time I saw the full weight of what he had been carrying, not the professionalism, not the steady attention he gave to everything around him, the person underneath all of that. A father who had failed his daughter in ways he could not fully explain, and had spent years walking quiet buildings at night because movement felt better than stillness, and alertness felt better than thought. I understood that feeling completely. His daughter flew up to Memphis in November. She was a tall, young woman in her early 30s with her father's stillness and her own version of his watchfulness. We met briefly when Raymond brought her to the diner on a Wednesday morning. She shook my hand and said she had heard a great deal about me. I told her the coffee at that diner was the best in Memphis, which was almost certainly not true, but which made her smile in a way that looked like her father. They were careful with each other, the way people are when they are rebuilding something that was not destroyed but only badly damaged. They did not rush. They called each week. She came back at Christmas. Raymond bought a small tree for the first time in years, which he mentioned to me in the same way he always mentioned personal things, as a fact stated without decoration, which was its own form of trust. I am 64 now. I still live in the house Gerald and I bought in 1998, the one with the big kitchen window that faces east and catches the morning light in a way that still surprises me sometimes. I have reinforced the locks and installed a motion sensor on the back porch, less out of fear than out of the knowledge that awareness is not the same as paranoia. I still think about my husband, about the complaint he filed quietly, dutifully, the way he did everything, and then set aside because he believed someone else would take it from there. He was not wrong. It just took longer than anyone expected, and traveled a stranger road. I think about how close everything came to ending differently. How a missing key fob and a falsified entry and a white truck with a cracked taillight were all present for weeks before I saw them as a pattern. How I might have driven home on an ordinary February morning and opened my back door and found something I was not prepared for. I think about the Tuesday nights I left coffee in a thermos outside the dispensary window for a man who never asked why I did it and never stopped being grateful. There is a woman who works the morning intake desk at my new office. She is in her 40s, new to the job, always arriving slightly breathless, with the particular exhaustion of someone managing too much alone. Last week, I brought an extra cup of coffee when I came in. I set it on the edge of her desk without saying anything. She looked up at me with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone who has been going a long time without being seen. "Thank you," she said. "You have no idea." But I did. I knew exactly what a small act of attention could mean at the right moment. I knew the distance between invisible and seen could be measured in a cup of coffee, a thermos left on a counter, a name remembered from one night to the next. I gave the night security guard coffee for months because it felt human, because grief had taught me the weight of passing through a world that does not look up. And when the moment arrived that required someone to pay attention, to be the kind of person who noticed and then did something with what they noticed, Raymond was that person. Not because I had bought anything from him, but because attention, once given freely, tends to return in kind. Be observant. Be present. Be the person who looks up. You cannot know, in the ordinary rhythm of ordinary nights, which cup of coffee might be the one that keeps you alive. But I can tell you this: the kindness is never wasted. Even when it seems to vanish into routine, it does not vanish. It simply waits for the moment when it matters most, and then it shows up. I gave the night guard coffee every shift. One February morning, he stepped in front of my car and said, "Do not go home the way you planned." And because of that, I am still here to tell this story. This is my true story from Memphis, Tennessee. What did this story mean to you? Tell me in the comments, and tell me your city. I want to know where you are watching from.